Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to this MyLab online research talk. I'm glad you're interested in this topic, and I see that we're a relatively small group, at least for the moment. So I would actually encourage a lively discussion the way that we would have it in person. It's always so weird to try to get to illicit interaction through Zoom, but we're going to do our best. So please type in the chat if you have random things to say, and please type in the Q&A if you have questions for the speakers. And I will also be monitoring the chat and trying to respond to people. So with the logistics out of the way, I'd like to introduce the two speakers. Andra and Joshua both worked in my lab at NYU. Andra was a PhD student, then transitioned to being a postdoc and is now a postdoc at Columbia. And Joshua did a short internship in the lab. I think it was 3 months or so, right? And then he went back to the University of Oxford and continued working on this project. As it happened, the two projects are closely related, and they also ended up finishing up around the same time. So we thought it would make sense to just present them as a single story. So without further ado, we'll get started with Andra. Sorry, Joshua, I forgot to say that Joshua is also a postdoc now. He also graduated in the meantime, so I should have mentioned that. But yeah, Andra is going to be our first presenter, and take it away.
Okay, so today we'll talk about visual search with heterogeneous distractors, work by myself, Joshua, and Weiji. So this work covers 2 preprints. My paper is under review. Joshua's has been accepted as an in-press, and please check them out. For my part of the presentation, a part of it will be focused on didactics. So there will be some discrepancies between the figures here and the figures in the paper, but we'll get to the results as well. Okay, so visual search. Visual search is a daily task for animals and humans. We have to identify our friend in a crowd, stay socially distanced. We have to detect whether the book we want is on this bookshelf or not, whether it's present or absent. And we have to locate the key that we want on a keychain. Sometimes search is not that difficult. For instance, if our friend has bright colored hair or clothing, or whether we're looking for the key to the front door and this objects and people look more distinctive. But arguably, more often than not, we have to search for people and objects among distractors that vary in appearance. So heterogeneous distractors. Okay, so psychophysics and signal detection theory approaches to visual search. A little bit of history. Psychophysics has proved a useful tool to understand the mechanisms of visual search. Within psychophysics, signal detection theory in particular has been very useful and played a large role. Researchers deliberately used very simple stimuli. This review by Palmer and Varghese and Pavel, 2000, it's very great. So the stimuli tended to be unidimensional, and they could be easily parametrically varied. The stimuli were briefly presented in order to prevent eye movements. They were presented at equal eccentricities, such as in this figure, and there was a wide spacing between stimuli in order to prevent crowding or other low-level influences. So signal detection theory models dissociate component processes, in particular an encoding stage of information and a decision stage about is the item present or absent or where is it in the case of search. And they can predict accuracy as a function of set size and target distractor similarity. And there's a lot of work on this. I'm just showing a few citations. And work has shown that indeed signal detection theory model has been able to explain visual search very well. Oops. Okay, so in order to keep calculations tractable, psychophysics signal detection SDT approaches to visual search have tended to use homogeneous distractors, such as in the previous figure, where we see that all these distractor lines are the same length. So this simplified calculations, however, this happened at the loss of ecological validity, because in the real world, as we said, distractors tend to be heterogeneous. So we extend this work and we make distractor heterogeneous, we still keep calculations tractable, and we fill in a little bit of a gap in the literature. There's less work on visual search with heterogeneous distractors within psychophysics as the approach, and this phenomena is less well understood. And the ecological validity is higher, arguably not quite at the level of real world search, but definitely higher. Okay, so to be fair, there is some work on visual search with heterogeneous distractors, and a lot of it, but with other approaches that are different than signal detection theory of psychophysics. So early work, as well as more recent, has shown that distractor heterogeneity tends to increase search times. A seminal study by Duncan and Humphreys proposed that search performance decreases as target distractor similarity increases, and that's no surprises here, and also that it decreases as distractor heterogeneity increases. And then there's an interaction between the two, namely that distractor heterogeneity impairs performance more so when target distractor similarity is also high. This proposal has been subjected to several tests, including by the authors, and there has been some support for it, but there are still some caveats. So heterogeneity has not been systematically varied. For instance, in the studies, there were letters, L's, and tilted T's at various angles. So with this type of stimuli, it might not be unambiguous to quantify what is distractor heterogeneity. So there's some caveats. Additionally, there's no process level understanding of observer decision-making like in SDT. Okay, so still, even to visual search with heterogeneous distractors, there has been some psychophysics signal detection theory approaches to it. So even since 2001, Ruth Rosenthal had a study on this. However, with that particular choice of distractor distributions, it turns out that human participants deviated from the SDT predictions. So there has been more work since then, including work from our group ever since 2011. Still, detailed characterization of search performance with respect to distractor statistics and task types are still lacking, so we're trying to enhance our understanding about this. Okay, so the outline of my part of the talk, we want to first assess in a comprehensive fashion which summary statistics related to distractor heterogeneity affect performance, and compare with Duncan and Humphreys. So we're going to use two task types within the same subject, localization and detection. And some previous work has looked at the comparison of visual search with localization, visual search with detection. And our particular localization task and alternative force choice localization has been used, to my knowledge, in only one other study. We want to fit an optimal observer model and see if it accounts for all this summary statistics presented in part one. So this models from this family have been shown to capture behavior pretty well in the studies, including Joshua's. And third goal, we want to look at visual search in memory and compare it with perception. And there has been some previous work, and it tends to support the fact that when we search for an object in the external world, it's a relatively similar process with searching for a memorized representation within our brain of the external world. And we'll see what we find. Okay, so visual search tasks and alternative force choice localization and detection. So a trial starts with a fixation screen, then the target is briefly presented. In this case, the target is characterized by its feature orientation, specifically its feature value, the orientation 25 degrees, let's say. After a delay, and this target is drawn from a uniform distribution. After a delay, a search array is presented. In localization, the target is always present just once, and the distractors are drawn from a uniform distribution. And the search array it could have the set size 2, 3, 4, or 6. And then the observer responds where they believe the target was, and they will give a mouse click to that particular location. So the detection task, the trial structure is very similar. There's one important difference, that the target is present only on half of the trials. And the participant will respond whether the target was present or absent with the button press. Observers also did the memory condition, which we will discuss later. So first we see that accuracy decreases with set size in both localization and detection. And this is not surprising, the set size effect, it's very well known for such a task. So we also see that chance is 1/n for localization and versus 1/2 always across set sizes for detection. However, many factors besides set size may affect performance, more so than homogeneous distractors, where we can talk about target distractor similarity in one way. Heterogeneous distractors afford rich summary statistics, which we'll use to characterize behavior. Okay, so let's imagine a trial and define our trial by trial summary statistics, which will be um, um, used in my study as well as Joshua's. So, okay, within a trial, what distractor statistics can we extract? Imagine that this is the target and these are the distractors. So it's possible that the presence of a distractor highly similar to the target, the most similar distractor, will influence performance. And this is also very plausible. So this will give rise to the minimum target distractor difference. So the difference in angles between these two gabors. It's also possible that the circular mean of all the distractors will influence performance. So this will give us the metric of the target to this, the distance between the target and the mean of the circular mean of the distractor. So this is TD mean. And now to match with Duncan and Humphrey's distractor heterogeneity, we will calculate the circular variance of the distractors. And this is just one way in which we can quantify distractor heterogeneity here. And this distractor variance will be a value between 0 and 1. So this 3 summary statistics we can get for both localization and detection. Now, for localization errors only, we also want to look at when participants respond erroneously, how close were they? So this is the most similar distractor. So it will get rank 1 because it's closer to the target. This one is second most similar, rank 2, and this one is third more similar. And we want to see how are their errors distributed according to this ranks of similarity of the response to the target. So, okay, how does performance depend on these 4 trial by trial summary statistics? So first summary statistics, most similar distractor, mean TD difference. Proportion correct increases as the minimum target to distractant difference increases, which makes sense. These are harder trials and people's responses are closer to chance. In the case of detection, again, we see that proportion correct tends to increase as minimum target distractor difference increases. Summary statistic 2, based on the mean of the distractors. The effects look more subtle visually, but we still get statistical significance for the effect of set size and target to distractor mean, and a similar pattern in detection. So target to distractor mean seems to influence proportion correct. So these p-values are from logistic regressions trying to predict accuracy with particular summary statistics and set size. So summary statistic 3, the circular variance of the distractor, we see that proportion correct seems to subtly decrease with distractor variance, and we do find evidence for this statistically, and same in the case of detection. Okay, so what about summary statistic 4? Given that localization errors have rich information, we see that when observers respond erroneously, they tend to choose more frequently distractors that are closer in rank to the target. And these distributions are significantly different from uniform. So, okay. We're putting all the summary statistics together for localization and detection. And this will, we will see if we'll be able to account this with the optimal observer model. So we're kind of setting the stage for the next part of the talk. Okay, so, but before that, we've seen that each of the summary statistics combined with set size was able to seem to influence performance. But we want to ask which summary statistics are useful and necessary for explaining performance. So for that, we're going to use a model comparison method inspired by stepwise regression from Shen and Ma in 2019. So we had logistic regressions and we added regressors and removed regressors in order to get at which ones are useful and necessary. So we found that the minimum target to distractor difference is the most useful regressor. This is not surprising. We did see that in the previous plots. It had the most salient effect. However, no regressor is necessary. So when attempting to remove regressors, the AIC model goodness of fit metric did not decrease too much. So this could be because mean TD difference is correlated to some extent with target to distractor mean, so they're not entirely independent. Okay, so to summarize part one, so we wanted to assess in a comprehensive fashion which summary statistics related to distractor heterogeneity affect performance and compare with Duncan and Humphreys. And we found a strong effect of mean TD difference, weaker effects of circular mean and circular variance of the distractors when we looked, when we analyzed the data in one way. We also found that the mean TD difference was the most useful distractor, the most useful factor. So this is to some extent, oh, Tommy? I cannot hear you.
Oh, he misclicked. Just keep going.
Okay. Okay. So this is consistent to some extent with Duncan and Humphreys, but not entirely, and there are some caveats. Okay, so for part two, we want to fit an optimal observer model and see if it accounts for these effects. So for this detailed breakdown, according to this detailed summary statistics that we defined, more so than previous studies. So, okay, as a recap, these are the summary statistics that we're attempting to account for with the optimal observer model. And these are not just qualitative trends. We will use the exact shapes of these curves to constrain the optimal observer model. So this Bayesian optimal observer model, the encoding stage and the decision stage, the two main stages, just as across SDT. So stimuli give rise to noisy measurements. So these are the stimuli and these are the noisy measurements. And we noticed that the structure is the same in localization and detection with some differences. For instance, we want to infer the location L, 1 to 3 or N, and we want to determine whether the target is present, which would be variable C being 1 and target absent variable C being 0. So in the decision stage, based on these noisy measurements and knowledge of this entire encoding process, the observers proceed as follows. In localization, the observer calculates the probability of each possible target location and chooses the most probable target location. So it's the maximum, essentially some form of max rule. In the case of detection, the observer calculates the probability that the target is present and reports target presence when this exceeds the criterion. And the optimal observer is assumed to maximize performance given the noise. Okay, so let's go over an example of the encoding stage. So let's say that the target is present at location 3. Each location is equally likely to contain the target in our setup. At location 3, the target has ST value 30 degrees. This is the entire stimulus vector. All orientations are independently drawn from uniform. Then noisy measurements of these orientations are assumed to be created in the observer's brain, and they are centered on the true orientation SI. So and this would give rise to this measurement vector. And the inverse width of this distribution over measurements is assumed to be itself a variable drawn from a gamma distribution with mean J bar. So this is how we also assume that there is variability in precision, variability across items and across trials. So, okay, what about the decision stage? How does the observer eventually pick a location? So the observer computes local decision variables DI. It uses this measurement vectors, and this DI local decision variables are computed as the log ratio of the probability of the measurement xi conditioned on the target being at location I, divided by the probability of the measurement xi conditioned on the possibility that there's a distractor at location I. And we see that this formula ends up being a function of a cosine of the measurement of xi minus st. So when this measurement xi is close to st, this value is close to 0, cosine is close to 1, and this t value increases. So the observer would be more likely to pick location I, the higher this t. So this is just a, I guess, intuitive depiction of what happens in the optimal observer model. Okay, so parameters and model fitting. The parameters are mean precisions at set size is 2, 3, 4, 6. A parameter for variability and precision, just like we saw on this slide, variability and precision. For detection, there is an extra p-present parameters. So the target is there present half the time, but observer might believe it's 55% or 49% or something like that. And there's also, we assume decision noise parameters in additional versions of the models. So this mean precisions and the parameter of variability and precision are important because we treat them both as separate parameters for localization and detection, as well as joint. So this would assume that this early stages would be shared between localization and detection, and so will the parameters. So we feed the localization and detection data both separately and jointly. And we do the maximum likelihood estimation of the parameters. We fit individual subject data. We get trial by trial predictions through simulations, and the algorithm for optimization that we use is Bayesian adaptive direct search developed by Luigi and Weiji. And we have resources on the lab's GitHub, as well as on the MALAB website resources, as well as on my GitHub for how we implement all this. Okay, so now fit this optimal observer model and see if it accounts for this effect. So how well does the fitted optimal observer model account for the summary statistics? So we see that the shaded areas mostly fall on top of the data points. And this is really good in localization. It's also really good in the frequency of occurrence with rank of similarity of response to target plots. So yeah, this is very nice to see. In the case of detection, the fits are not bad. However, there are some discrepancies. They're not quite as fabulous as in localization. But still, we have to remember that we asked for mean precision parameters and one for variability, and together with a p present, so 6 parameters total to account for double the data. So this is a lot to ask of 6 parameters. So the fact that the model fits as well as it does is not trivial. So now let's look at the fits separately. So indeed, if we fit separately to localization, allowing for their own precisions, and separately to detection, allowing for their own precisions, the fits are actually good in both conditions, even in the detection condition. So we still notice some discrepancies here, but they can be fixed by adding a decision noise parameter. Okay, so what did we learn from fitting this optimal observer model? We saw that it was able to capture the localization and detection data broken down by this rich summary statistics. And this was the case both separately and also jointly. And jointly, it's interesting because it shows that it's likely that there are shared early encoding processes of visual information. And it was great that this held across both task types. So part 3, visual search in memory, and compare with perception. Okay, so the memory condition is very similar to the perception condition, but the order of the presentation of the target and the search array was flipped. So first, the observer was presented with the search array, and they had to keep it in mind over the delay period of 1 second. And then the target was revealed, and observers were supposed to locate where the target is in their memorized representation of the stimuli. And analogously in the case of the detection, except make the decision target present or absent. So we see that accuracy, proportion correct, decreases as a function of set size, and that it is slightly lower than in the case of perception. And this is not surprising. Okay, so the summary statistics are very similar. We see the most striking increase of proportion correct with the increase in mean TD difference, and more subtle variations with the other distractor statistics. And we see similar patterns of the frequency of occurrence in the case of the localization errors. Okay, so how does the model perform here? The model performs very well as well. The shaded areas fall on top of the data points. And this is again joint fits to localization and detection. We assumed that the mean precision parameters are shared. Okay, so we see that the mean precision parameter decreases with set size in perception and in memory. So we showed the values here for the joint condition. The patterns are similar for the separate localization and separate detection condition. So log J bar, a log mean precision, decreases with set size and is there's some evidence that it is higher in perception than in memory. So what did we learn from this study of visual search in memory, and how does it compare with perception? We saw the effects of summary statistics on performance is very similar between perception and memory. So this links to theories that searching for something in the outside world and searching for something in your memory tend to share large similarities. The optimal observer model also fits well to memory, and accuracy and precision tend to be lower in memory than in perception, which makes intuitive sense. So we did another experiment, and we found the consistent patterns of results even when we put the stimuli closer together to have smaller stimulus spacing. So experiment 1, the items were 60 degrees apart. In the case of set size 6, this is how they were distributed on the screen. In experiment 2, items were 30 degrees apart, and this is how, in the case of set size 6, were distributed. So the results were very, very similar. Okay, so these are the conclusions. I'm presenting all of them here. So yeah, we've looked at summary statistics and how they influence search performance. We were able to fit an optimal observer model across a variety of task types and memory conditions. And in particular, we saw that visual search in memory is similar to perception, but with a decrease in accuracy and precision. Okay, so limitations and open questions. So interactions between summary statistics, this was one part of Duncan and Humphrey's proposals. We didn't have enough trials to assess. Why did we find decision noise in detection but not localization? This is puzzling. We did not have comparison with alternative models, either based on heuristics. Joshua will have that though, or summary statistics. Okay, so we made a step towards naturalistic visual search, but how close are we? Joshua will discuss more about this again. Nevertheless, revisiting psychological theories with optimal observer models can contribute to our understanding of visual search and more broadly to psychology and neuroscience. Okay, so thank you. The MALAB, Weiji, Joshua, and everyone in the lab and the whole NYU CNS and Psych departments, everybody was super helpful, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andra. So this is time for questions. So you can type your questions, or you can just raise your hand and we'll let you speak. There were already several questions in the Q&A, and I try to answer those, but if there are still follow-up questions, we also take those. And while people are formulating questions, maybe a little bit of an addition from me. So what I find interesting about Andra's approach is that we are not taking those summary statistics as the input to the model, but they are just a feature of the stimuli that has effects that can be predicted by the model, right? So in a way, the optimal observer model is the more principled process model, and then the effects of things like minimum target distractor distance or distractor variance, they fall out. And this is a little bit philosophy that from what some of you might be familiar with, where you would just try to quantify the summary statistics and put those into a regression to predict behavior. So that's a very great start. That's a more of a descriptive approach. But the potential power of these optimal observer models, and in fact, a broader class of process models, is that you don't have to start with those summary statistics. You can start with basics, what's happening in the trial-to-trial, item-to-item level, and then eventually get at predictions that you can then quantify in terms of summary statistics. There's another open question from Gavin. For set size smaller than 6, are the stimuli positions randomly distributed?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, so there's, I guess, one that speaks to be the first, and that's randomized over the screen. So they will appear in various locations.
Yeah, there could be gaps. And in the second experiment with smaller distance, there were no gaps, right? Do you remember that correctly?
So no, actually there are no gaps. I think it's, well, they're kind of joined together. So like you randomize the location, but then the next ones will be sequential, starting from that location clockwise.
Right.
Or
in experiment 2. but not in experiment 1.
Experiment 1 as well. So they're not, yeah.
Okay, so they're contiguous.
They're contiguous, yeah, that's the word.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is different to in my experiment, just to say.
Okay, yeah. More questions for Andrea. Okay. There's a question from Larry. Beautiful work. Thank you. Could the model be extended to predict the optimal location of a single saccade, similar to Geisler's work?
I think that would be a different type of model with shared concepts, but yeah, I guess we're just assuming that people are not making any saccades, but yeah, that's
yeah, Larry, I'm familiar with that line of work. It's fascinating. There's super interesting follow-ups by Konstantin Rodkov in his group and by Young and Wolpert. But it's a bit of a different question, right? Which is how you sample information from environment. Yeah, we're just not touching on that here. Okay, more questions can come, but in the meantime, let's give the floor to Joshua. Andrea, maybe you have to stop sharing.
Oh,
oh no, it's working. It's working. Yeah.
I think I can take over. Yeah. So, can you see that all right? And can you hear me?
Seems working. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. So thanks again to everyone for joining the meeting today. It's been really interesting to kind of read the questions that people have had. It'll be really interesting to answer some more at the end and to have a discussion. In this second part of the session, I'm going to be discussing a study which Weiji and I conducted and which directly builds on the work that Andrea has just presented. And the work is in a preprint titled Explaining the Effects of Distractor Statistics in Visual Search. So first, we'll have a look at the task that me and Weiji used, and then we'll look at the specific ways in which this study kind of helps us build on the results that Andrea has discussed. We'll go into the patterns identified by Duncan and Humphreys in a bit more detail. We'll also be looking at the effects of changing the statistics of the distribution from which distractors are drawn. And we call these different distractor environments. I'll talk more about those in a minute. We'll be comparing the optimal Bayesian model to a heuristic model. And finally, we'll discuss limitations of the study, but also limitations that kind of apply more generally to this psychophysics approach to visual search, which has been developed by several researchers over the last few decades. So I used a very similar task to Andrea's. Participants were presented with between 2 and 6 Gabble patches, and then they had to respond just reporting whether or not a particular target Gabble patch was present. And the target Gabble patch was a Gabble patch with an orientation of 45 degrees clockwise. And participants were just reporting whether or not this was present. So this was just the detection case that Andrea discussed and not the localization case. Another difference to Andrea's study is that we had 2 different distractor environments. So we had 2 different conditions in which the distractors were drawn from different distributions. In the uniform conditions, distractors were drawn from a uniform distribution and could take any angle with equal probability. In the concentrated condition, distractors were drawn from a distribution that was centered on the target orientation. So they were more likely to have an orientation similar to the target orientation. And in each block of trials, the distractors were either drawn from the uniform distribution or the concentrated distribution. And participants were always told which distribution was being used for that block of trials. Again, we'll talk about the same distractor statistics, or at least the 3 that apply to detection. So we'll talk about target to distractor mean difference, or TD mean, so just the difference between the target and the mean of the distractors. We'll talk about distractor variance and minimum target to distractor difference, so the distance in orientation between the orientation of the target and the orientation of the most similar distractor. And one subtlety that is worth mentioning is that we could either look at sample distractor statistics or population distractor statistics. So we could either look at sample distractor statistics and look at the mean and variance of the gabbles shown on a particular trial, or we could look at the mean and the variance of the distribution from which the gabbles are drawn. And we'll focus mostly on, we'll talk almost always about sample distractor statistics, but we can say something very, very kind of minimal about population distractor statistics because we've got these two different distractor environments. So we can say something very, very small about those, but mostly when we're talking about distractor statistics, we'll be talking about sample distractor statistics. So first of all, we'll talk a bit more about the patterns that Duncan and Humphreys identified. So Duncan and Humphreys, as Andreas described, thought that as distractor variance increases, the difficulty of visual search would increase, but that as target to distractor mean difference increased, visual search would become easier. And they also thought the two interacted such that the most difficult searches are ones in which the target and the distractor mean are very, very similar, so a low target to distractor mean difference, but in which the distractor variance is very high. And a kind of consequence of this is that they thought at high target to distractor mean difference, the kind of harmful effect of distractor variance would be minimal. Okay, so we had a look for these patterns in our data, and on this plot here, we've got accuracy on the y-axis and distractor variance on the x-axis. And we binned the trials into 3 bins according to target to distractor mean difference, and they're shown in the different colors here. To analyze the results, we ran logistic regressions. So there's been a bit of discussion about this already, but we ran logistic regressions with distractor statistics as predictors and accuracy as an outcome variable. And we took the coefficients from those regressions and analyzed those across participants. And this analysis suggested that target to distractor mean difference, as target to distractor mean difference increases, accuracy increases. As distractor variance increases, accuracy decreases, but there is also an interaction. So this all sounded quite like the Duncan Humphreys story, but unfortunately the interaction doesn't quite match with their picture. So the interaction was such that at high target to distractor mean difference, so when the mean of the distractors is very far from the target, distractor variance was actually more harmful to performance than when the distractors and the target, the distractor mean was similar to the target, which is inconsistent with the idea that the Duncan and Humphreys had about the pattern that would be taken. So one thing about these results is that we might not have the full picture, and you might be looking at the figure on the right and thinking, I can't really see these patterns. I think that's definitely one reason to be suspicious about these results that we got out of this logistic regression. And one reason these results might not match up well with the picture is because it might be that the relationship between accuracy and distractor variance isn't well described by a logistic relationship. And in that case, we shouldn't put too much weight on the results of that regression. Another reason, though, is that if we include more predictors in the regression, such as min TD difference and the number of stimuli, then the effects of distractor mean and distractor variance and their interaction are no longer significant, suggesting that, well, first of all, very similar to what Andrew found. So Andrew has already described that minimum TD difference, target distractor difference, was possibly the most important variable. But this result suggests that maybe mean and variance aren't the key variables. So for example, it could be that minimum target to distractor difference is kind of the key causally relevant variable, and the effects of mean and variance show up because they're correlated with min TD difference. So having found a kind of a bit of a mixed picture when comparing Duncan Humphrey's predictions with our data, we next went on and did what Andrew did as well, which was ask whether a Bayesian optimal observer model can account for the observed patterns. And particularly interesting in our case is the question of whether the model can capture that precise relationship between mean and variance and accuracy that didn't quite fit with the Duncan Humphreys story, and which also possibly wasn't well captured by logistic regression. And it will also be especially interesting to look at whether the Bayesian model can capture the effect of different distractor environments, which is one of the ways in which we're building on the results that Andrew's discussed. So just like before, we assume that the observer only receives noisy measurements of the true orientations of the items in the display. And X here represents those noisy measurements of the orientations. And the Bayesian observer then takes those measurements X and uses them to compute the probability that the target is present and the probability that the target's absent, and takes the ratio and uses that to make their decision. And we can then fit the model to data and look at how well the model accounts for the patterns that are present. Here we've got the figure that we saw earlier, so accuracy on the y-axis, distractor variance on the x-axis, and target to distractor mean difference represented by different colors. And now, just as before, the error bars represent the data, but the shading represents the model. And we can see that the model quite nicely captures the different patterns in the relationship between mean and variance and their interaction. In addition to asking whether the model could account for these tricky patterns, we also wanted to see if the model could account for these different distractor environments. So just starting at very broad level, we looked at the relationship between accuracy and number of stimuli. So that's shown on this plot on the right, with accuracy on the y-axis, number of stimuli on the x-axis, and then in the two different colors, data from either the uniform distractor environment or the concentrated distractor environment. And the Bayesian model accounted for the differences between these two conditions well. So then we kind of went on to we went on to think about whether the model could capture kind of finer details, and we can break things down further. So of course we can break things down by distractor environment, but we can also break things down by the number of stimuli and whether the target was present or absent. And then we can look at the behavior in the data and according to the model. So in these plots, on the y-axis is the probability that the observer gave a target present report. And on the x-axis, there's target to distractor mean difference. And across this kind of like range of conditions in these different settings, again, the Bayesian optimal observer model does a really good job of capturing the different patterns in the data. Okay, so one final way in which we wanted to build on the results that Andrew's already discussed is we wanted to compare a Bayesian model with a non-Bayesian model. And in particular, it's interesting to think about whether simpler heuristic models can explain the data equally well. We considered a heuristic model that has a long history in psychophysics. So we considered an observer that receives, again, noisy measurements of the orientations, like the Bayesian observer. However, instead of combining these noisy measurements, represented by X, into an estimate of the probability that the target is present or absent, this observer just says which measured orientation is closest to the target orientation. And then the observer takes that value and applies some threshold and says, is this closest orientation close enough? So look at all the orientations and say which orientation is closest to the target orientation, and then they say, is that orientation close enough for me to report target present? We compared 4 different models. So we compared the Bayesian model with this heuristic model. But for each of these 2 decision rules, we also used models in which observers use the difference between the 2 distractor environments, and models in which observers ignore the difference between the 2 distractor environments. And here we've got the modeling results. So we fit the models and then compare the models using AIC and BIC. Model 1 and 2 are the Bayesian models. Models 3 and 4 are the heuristic models. And then in the plots on the right, we've got on the top y-axis, the mean difference in AIC between each model and the best fitting model. And on the bottom y-axis, the mean difference in BIC between each model and the best fitting model. And so in these plots, the best fitting model is the one with the lowest AIC or the lowest BIC. And unfortunately, we have this case where, according to the AIC, model 3 fit best, but according to the BIC, model 1 fit best. And there seems no sensible reason to favor one of these information criteria over the other, given that they're both approximations. And so given the 2 information criteria disagree, we didn't want to draw any strong conclusions about whether the Bayesian model or the heuristic model was better. There's perhaps some evidence that people are learning and using the difference between the environments, because both of the best fitting models are models in which observers use that difference between the 2 distractor environments. One thing we can ask is, why was the model comparison inconclusive? And I think a great way to do this is to think about the rules which the 2 observers use to map their noisy measurements to a decision. And we can represent those rules using a figure. So for simplicity, let's consider a case in which there's only two items in the display. And then in this figure here, we're plotting the observer's noisy measurement of those 2 items. So on the x-axis is the observer's noisy measurement of the orientation of item 1. And on the y-axis is the observer's noisy measurement of the orientation of item 2. And for convenience here, we're plotting in degrees relative to the target orientation. So 0 degrees represents the orientation that the target has. And we can then ask for which pairs of noisy measurements the Bayesian observer would report target present, and for which pairs of noisy measurements would the Bayesian observer report target absent. And it turns out that for under a range of conditions, the Bayesian observer uses an area that looks something like this to make their choices. So if the noisy measurements fall within the lines here, the Bayesian observer reports target present. But if the noisy measurements fall outside the lines, the Bayesian observer reports target absent. The reason why the Bayesian model and the heuristic model are difficult to distinguish is because this area is actually, in fact, very similar to the area used by the heuristic observer that we considered. So considering now the heuristic observer, and consider the case where the measurement of item 1 is the measured orientation closest to the target orientation. And our heuristic observer says, if item 1 is measured, the orientation for item 1, if the measured orientation for item 1 is closer to the target orientation, then I don't care what the measurement for item 2 is. I'm just going to use the measurement for item 1 to make my decision. So the heuristic observer will report target present if their measurements fall within this gray area. So it doesn't matter what the measurement for target 2 was, as long as their measurement for target 1 was close enough to the target orientation, as long as their measurement for item 1 was close enough to the target orientation, they'll report target present. But of course, a similar argument applies for item 2. So if item 2 is the closest item, it doesn't matter what the measured orientation for item 1 was. If the measured orientation for item 2 is close enough to the target orientation, they'll report target present. And it turns out then that the area used by the heuristic observer that leads the heuristic observer to make a target present report is very similar in shape to the area used by the Bayesian observer. And so there's actually very few cases in which the Bayesian observer would report target present, but the heuristic observer wouldn't. There might be some settings in which it is easier to distinguish those two models, and I'll be happy to discuss those later if anyone was interested. Okay, so limitations that apply to the study, and then limitations that are more general. In terms of some study-specific limitations, we wanted to kind of compare our results to Duncan and Humphreys, but there's a few differences to the work of Duncan and Humphreys. So first of all, we've looked at accuracy. Actually, I already saw a question about this in the Q&A. So we've looked at accuracy, but Duncan and Humphreys looked at reaction time. And actually, they looked at how reaction time changed as set size increased. And another difference is that we've focused on sample distractor statistics, but Duncan and Humphreys are pretty clear that they think both are important. So it could be that Duncan and Humphreys were right about the effects of population distractor statistics, which we haven't really studied here. So yeah, perhaps more importantly, there's limitations that apply to, there's limitations regarding the applicability of the results to naturalistic visual search. So Andrew already mentioned this. And here we've got an example of naturalistic visual search. So in this picture, your aim is to find the chairs. And as you're looking around the picture, you're obviously making saccades. The scene's very complex. Objects aren't easily separated from each other. And it becomes clear from this example that naturalistic visual search involves so many things that we haven't studied. And for a really nice summary and kind of review of all the ways in which naturalistic visual search differs from the kind of task that we've used here, there's a really nice summary in Palmer et al. 2000. And if you want the full reference, then just drop me an email. So yeah, so we've seen that there's in naturalistic visual search, there's a whole range of processes. So there's isolating objects, encoding sensory information, selecting saccades, and the decision mechanism. And we've just studied one or two of those processes, and we've focused down on one or two of those processes. So I think the conclusion is that we can only understand a part of what makes up naturalistic visual search. And just to kind of summarize then, we've seen today that using the psychophysics approach developed by several different researchers over the last decades, we were able to precisely characterize the effects of heterogeneous distractors. We were also able, using this approach, to isolate particular components of the process of visual search, so in particular focusing on the decision mechanism. And Andrew also looked to some extent at the encoding of information. And using both these kind of features, we were able to test a Bayesian variant of signal detection theory, and found that Bayesian signal detection theory models can provide a really good account across different visual search tasks and also across different contexts in visual search tasks. And yeah, I'd just like to thank Weijie and Andrea and other people that have helped, like Heiko and Luigi, and some really helpful comments from reviewers.
Thank you, Joshua. So are there any questions? I see already 3 in the Q&A. The first question is by Andre for you, Joshua. Could you clarify why the model predicts a somewhat U-shaped effects of the distractor variance when TD mean is low? It was that way on the modeling results plot.
Yes, okay. I'll just share my screen again, maybe. Okay, so why does the model predict the U-shape effect? Okay, I'm going to have to, it's a good question. I'm going to have a think for a second. So the finding is that distractor variance is most harmful kind of middle values. So I'm not actually entirely sure off the top of my head. I'd have to have a think about it. But
So
you kind of...
I could imagine is that at very high distractor variance, distractors also tend to be farther away from the target. So that might help a little bit with accuracy, right? Because as we said earlier, all those summary statistics are correlated. So distractor variance, especially on the extreme high end, is going to also constrain distractor mean.
Yeah, and I guess also that might be especially important in the concentrated condition, because when the distractors, in the condition where the distractors tend to be concentrated on the target orientation, if distractor variance is high, you're spreading them out away from the target. Yeah, great question.
Why is that not happening in between? I guess because the target distractor mean is not zero, right? It's small. So in the sort of the earlier regime, when you increase distractor variance, you're actually pushing more distractors towards the target, right? And then at some point it's going to go away from the target again. I think that's my intuition.
Yeah, I would say that I think this kind of question actually highlights how out of what seems like fairly simple models, you can get some really quite complicated predictions that become really hard to understand quite quickly.
So one answered question was less of a question, more a comment by Dennis Pelly about the Balmer factor and whether we're in the crowding regime. And Dennis's conclusion is that we are staying out of that, and that's really good to know. And I'm also interested in those that most recent work from Dennis's lab, where the factor is measured with greater precision. Then the next open question is also a comment from Larry that there's no puzzle in finding that two non-Bayesian model is so close to a Bayesian model that you cannot longer distinguish them. And I think we all agree with that.
There's no puzzle.
Yeah, that there's no puzzle. But of course, they are still different models, right? So you could, in the limit of infinite data, you would be able to distinguish them. It's just that the signal to noise ratio is not high enough. Thank you, Larry. Let's see if there's any more questions. Feel free to raise your hand. Xiang, do you have a question? You have your hand up. Okay, maybe not. So yeah, let's open the floor to a general discussion from to either speaker or more broadly about this approach. And just to jumpstart that discussion, I would actually like to express some concerns that I have about this entire line of work that we've been doing in the lab. Andrea and Joshua and I have been talking about this, which is pretty much that we've made a very specific turn early on here, which is the philosophy that was promoted by Palmer, Verghese, Nico Eckstein, many others, who say, well, you have to study visual search, maybe not like Treisman does, but in these very controlled displays with brief presentation time, focusing on accuracy rather than reaction time, and same eccentricity, single dimensional stimuli. And as we've seen in these two presentations and in other similar work, you can get really far in understanding that kind of visual search, but you're paying a price. And the price you're paying is that it's easy to think of this search as being highly abstract and remote from natural search, and Andra and Joshua both already mentioned this. So is that price too high? What does everybody in the audience think? Like, is there too big of a gap between the way that our lab studies visual search and similar labs study visual search, and on the one hand, and natural search like Jeremy Wolf or maybe Friesman style search on the other hand? Or do you think that that gap can be bridged? I see several hands up, so I believe Larry was first. Larry, go ahead. I'm going to allow you to talk.
Yes. Okay, hi. So I just wanted to say it's beautiful work. I really enjoyed both presentations very much. And really, I was posing a challenge, which is, could you take the kinds of information you can measure with these paradigms and use them to predict a very simple extension where you're allowed one saccade in visual search? This is a sort of Najemnik in Geisler paradigm, but simplified very much so you have only one. And so I would say it would be a bit of a triumph if the data that you've collected could be used to accurately predict what happens when you're allowed to make one saccade or two or three. And you basically have to actually search by moving your fixation point.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, Andra, Joshua, do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, Andrew, you're on mute.
Joshua, okay.
So yeah, I think this would be really interesting. And let's say if there's two distractors relatively close to the target, maybe the participant will saccade towards one of them or the other. So that would be interesting to see. And I didn't mention this as a limitation, but I think that that's where this suggestion would be all the more interesting for extensions to even higher set sizes. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, brief response from me. Oh, sorry, Joshua, you were going to say something too.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it's a really good, really cool idea, actually. It seems like maybe there's different things you could separate out here. So one thing you could do is predict what decisions people make without any saccades, which is what we've done. You could predict what saccade people will make, but also you could just like look at the saccade that they made using an eye tracker, and then on the basis of whether I was to start with and what they saw later, you could again make another prediction about their decision. But yeah, it seems to me there's lots of things you could break down. But I think starting with one saccade and seeing if you could predict what saccade they're going to make and what decision would be a really cool thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Mostly in, sorry, Andra, go ahead.
I think Joshua has this data, maybe not saccades, but maybe microsaccades on some percentage of trials. So yeah.
Yeah. So most in the spirit of Najemnik and Geisler would probably be to predict where the saccade is going to land. So then you at least need to model like a first stage where everything is peripheral, and then the brain has to do some kind of optimization about which saccade is going to yield most information. Yeah, great idea. I could see that happen. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you for those references. We'll check them out.
So the next with their hand up is Dennis. I'm going to allow you to talk, Dennis.
Hi, wonderful talks, thank you. Is my camera on?
We see just your name, yeah, no, sir,
Okay,
no.
Sorry, I don't see how to turn it on. In the modeling, I was surprised that you had such great success without ever mentioning eccentricity, unless perhaps you made the decision noise dependent on eccentricity. I think that in the earlier work, when they didn't exclude crowding, crowding is a very strongly dependent eccentricity. In that case, it's essential to have your experiments be restricted to one eccentricity. Otherwise, you're mixing up eccentricities, and it's very hard to model. It would, but you guys have excluded crowding, and I'm surprised that you can succeed without mentioning eccentricity at all.
So just to clarify, are all our stimuli were at the same eccentricity?
Yeah.
So
okay, fine.
Yeah, then it's not necessary.
All right. Yeah. So that I mean, you were talking about the limitation of these very simplified stimuli.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting thing to see. If you just, restrict yourself to 2 rings of eccentricity,
Yes.
how do you cope with that? Yeah.
Yes. A great suggestion, Dennis. Joshua, you had something to say as well?
That's a really good idea.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Next is Gavin. Gavin, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting study. My comment slash my comment is more of like the discussion that we were raising at the start about sacrificing maybe real-world applicability for lab control. And this point is sort of related to the one that was brought up just now about eccentricity and eye movements. So I think in the real world, a lot of search involves a lot of eye movements, right? And I think one of the major things that a lot of models are not considering is the eye. So for example, in Rosenholz's model, we consider the resolution of the eye, and like in Zielinski's model, we consider eye movements because processing is limited in the periphery, and then the processing is highest in the fovea. And there are also studies that have shown, so for example, from my lab, eye movements are cheap and easy to make. So people tend to make a lot of eye movements, even though it ends up hurting their performance in terms of like slower reaction times. So this is just something to add to the discussion, that I think we should still consider the eye, like the resolution of the retina, and even like extending further into the visual system, like V1, having like cortical magnification and things like that, which sort of relates to the point brought up just now about looking at saccades and eccentricity effects.
Thank you, Gavin. Andre, Joshua, either of you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you for this comment. So I guess we're really simplifying things by not allowing the observers to make eye movements. So the brief stimulus presentation time kind of implicitly prevents that. In Joshua's experiment, I think he like enforced that with an eye tracker in addition to the implicit way to prevent it by having this short stimulus presentation time. So yeah, I guess it does make sense that if allowed, people would make these eye movements, and I guess I'm not familiar with those exact models, and I guess what you said, that it might actually even hurt their performance. Yeah, I guess we've just not like opened up this complications by keeping things stable, but that would be really interesting to test. And it seems like it would be possible to have a few extensions, but
Joshua, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, and it just kind of reinforces that if we're going to get a full understanding of naturalistic visual search, then we need to combine these different pieces together. And we've just kind of like looked at one very small piece, but we haven't looked at really important things like eye movements. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's possible to combine, of course, eye movements with ideal observed modeling, like the Najemnik and Geisler paper that Larry mentioned, and this Young and Wolpert paper that I really like a lot myself. So yeah, I think there's future in going the direction. I don't know how far you can push that. But yeah, I do also feel uncomfortable about leaving out eye movements altogether. It's good psychophysical tradition to enforce fixation, but it is limiting, especially for visual search. All right, let's go to Andre. Andre, go ahead.
Hey, first of all, I also want to say that I really like this work. I was thinking that eye movements are nice, but of course in visual search, especially if you increase the sizes, not always observers make those eye movements, and they can easily use covert attention to do the search. So maybe it would be, or perhaps as an alternative, you can also think of modeling the response times, because there are models linking ideal observers to response times in the search task. Maybe this is also something to think about, and it would definitely be closer to more realistic situations. Thank
Yeah, thank you, Andre. Joshua, Andra?
Yeah, thank you for this comment. So yeah, indeed, we also have this piece of data. We have the reaction times, and we are not using them, and we could look into these models that are linking the two together, and that we might provide more information. So thanks for this suggestion.
So Andre, just to my personal opinion, I'm scared of time. Time is really scary to me, and that fear comes from how messy those models become once you start fitting choices and reaction times simultaneously. So anybody who has tried to fit drift diffusion models with collapsing boundaries realize A, that they're very hard to fit, and B, that normativity goes out the window pretty quickly. And maybe I'm just too attached to notions of optimality. That's I've shied away from that. It's definitely possible. People have done it, but typically in very somewhat restricted conditions. So you have to make relatively strong assumptions about, for example, when you stop integrating. But yeah, that's my personal opinion. I tend to stay away from time, and lots of people have criticized me for that.
I guess you can bring normativity into it, and you can say what's the optimal time to stop, and there's been different papers on that. But then things get even more complicated.
Yeah, I know, like the paper that I like is Jan Drugovic's paper on like optimal bound setting, dynamic programming. To be honest, that is complex, and it's hard to fit that to psychophysical data. It's doable, perhaps, for people smarter than me. Yeah. Okay. Xiang has been waiting for a while. Xiang, go ahead.
Yeah, super interesting work. I was just wondering about Joshua's work about this distractor variance within one location. For example, you have a target and the queue, then you have a ISVP string, then you have whether you have a target in between the ISVP string. Will Joshua's model explain this situation?
Unfortunately, I didn't fully hear you. Did Joshua, Andra, did you hear Xiang's question?
No, would you mind just repeating the question once more? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering whether your modeling approach can also explain one situation where you have a target and the queue, then you have a ISVP string afterwards, then the distractor variance can be manipulated within this ISVP string.
Yeah. So a rapid serial visual presentation. I think it's a different paradigm. You could do that. We tend to model situations where all the information is present simultaneously. Once you have a stream of stimuli, then you also get serial position effects like a recency, primacy, and recency. It's a different kind of paradigm. Yeah, I don't think we have that much to say about that right now. Yeah. Anything?
Is that sorry, Luigi.
Yeah. Anything else, Joshua, Andra?
Yeah, no, I just yeah, I guess the discussion is kind of putting in sharp focus the kind of limitations of the study in which we've kind of focused on something very specific, which has advantages, but also it means we can only say something about something, a very specific process.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
So there was a question by Jamie Mazer, and Andra already answered that in the Q&A. Yeah, so Definitely, we could. There was a similar question earlier about color orientation. We could extend our model to multiple features. We're also reaching the limit, I think, there in terms of what we can do experimentally, because you need quite a lot of trials in order to fit these models, and of course that multiplies once you have multiple features. I'd be interested to know what you think are the interesting questions there. Like, of course, get more realistic, but like, what are the specific questions that pertain to the interactions of heterogeneity and having multiple features? Then let's see, we have two comments from, one comment from Dennis with reference. Thank you, Dennis. Ella, have you thought of introducing a relational structure within the stimuli group? So the stimulus at position X predicts stimulus at position Y with a certain probability. This could make the search more naturalistic. I'm not sure how much this would complicate the modeling. So yeah, that's one of, we actually did that. This is a paper by Manisha Bhartwai, myself, and Kreso Josic. And it was difficult to model this because you are, it's actually, you cannot assume that observers actually learn those correlations. Correlations are hard to learn in general. So you also have to consider models where those correlations are partially learned. And very quickly you end up with models that are very, very difficult to distinguish. So if I remember correctly, we couldn't draw very strong conclusions there. Beyond that, people do seem to take into account some aspect of those correlations. So I would refer you to that paper. And I think that's all in terms of the questions that I see here. Does anybody else want to speak? Oh, Larry has his hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, Larry.
Okay. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. No, I just had a comment that within the signal detection framework, it's very natural to alter loss functions in prior odds. And this is a very powerful way to explore models that in one particular context are supposed to be optimizing detection of signals, and might be something to think about as a way of doing this. Jemnik and Geisler, for example, are optimizing the expected number of saccades, which is an odd measure, and I think would be a little bit difficult to model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, if there are no more questions, then everybody, thank you very much for coming, and thanks to Josh and Andra for the presentations.
Yeah.
And if you have follow-up questions, then please email us. I'm going to put Josh and Andra's email addresses in the chat here. And everybody, thank you for coming again, and hope to see you in the future. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.